The last thing my mother said to me before she hung up the phone, on a Tuesday night in February, while I was sitting in my car in a hospital parking lot in Calgary eating a cold sandwich for dinner, was, "You know, sometimes I think your father and I would have had an easier life if Marcus had just been an only child." She didn't say it cruelly. That was the part that stayed with me. She said it the way you might comment on the weather, matter of fact, a little tired, like she was simply reporting something she'd observed. Then she told me she had to go because her and my father's dinner reservation was at 7, and she'd call me again soon. She did not call again soon. That was February. By June, I had decided I was done letting it live in my chest like a stone I couldn't put down. I saw my therapist twice a week. I ran the Bow River pathway every morning, before my first patient arrived. I reminded myself, on the days it was hard to believe, that the clinic I had built from nothing, the clinic whose waiting list had stretched to 6 weeks, whose name had started appearing in places I never expected, was real, and it was mine, and no one in my family had any part in making it. I had moved to Calgary 4 years earlier with $12,000 in savings, a physiotherapy license, and the particular determination that only comes from being told, repeatedly and in small ways, that you are not quite enough. My father's side of the family was in real estate development. My brother Marcus had gone into finance, and the general understanding in our household growing up in Oakville was that success looked like Bay Street, or a corner office, somewhere along the 401 corridor, or at the very least a house in a neighborhood where the property values made sense. What success did not look like, according to the unspoken curriculum of our family dinners, was moving west to work with your hands and build something quiet and slow. I had been good at school. Better than Marcus. Actually, though that was a fact, nobody really tracked out loud. I had been accepted to 3 graduate programs, won a scholarship that paid for my clinical placement, graduated near the top of my cohort. My parents had attended my convocation ceremony in a way that felt like they were checking a box. My father shook the hand of the department chair and asked him what the job market looked like, as though I wasn't standing right there in my gown. My mother had worn a dress she'd also worn to Marcus's high school graduation, and I noticed, and I think she knew I noticed, and neither of us said anything about it. When I left for Calgary, my father drove me to the airport and told me to call if I needed anything. I didn't call, not because I didn't need things, but because I understood that calling would cost me something I couldn't afford to keep spending. In Calgary, I built things slowly and carefully, the way you do when no one is watching, and no one is waiting to be impressed. I took on patients nobody else wanted. I specialized in post-surgical recovery, sports rehabilitation, complex cases that other clinics had given up on. Word spread the way it does in a city that is smaller than it looks. A hockey player's wife mentioned me to her neighbor, who mentioned me to her family doctor, who started sending referrals. Within 2 years, I had hired 2 associates. Within 3, I had a second location in the southeast end of the city. The year I turned 28, a journalist from a national healthcare publication reached out because someone had nominated me for a feature on innovative clinic founders under 35. I didn't tell my parents about the feature. I'm not sure why, except that telling them would have required me to want something from them, some reaction, some acknowledgement, and I had worked very hard to stop wanting things from them. The article ran in the spring. I framed 1 copy and hung it in the staff room, and I put the rest in a box in my storage unit and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that my first instinct had been to hide it. My brother Marcus called me that spring, which was unusual enough that I picked up on the second ring. He told me he was engaged. Her name was Claire. She was a nurse practitioner, he said, and she was originally from Red Deer, which I thought was funny, because my mother had always maintained a specific and unexamined preference for girlfriends who were from the right postal codes. He said the engagement party was in August, at a golf club in Oakville, and that he really wanted me there. "Mom and Dad are expecting you," he said, and then, before I could say anything, "I'm expecting you, that's different." I believed him. That was the complicated thing about my brother. He was not a bad person. He was someone who had been handed a throne as a child, and had sat in it without much reflection for 27 years. But underneath the ease and the confidence and the Bay Street suits, there was someone who, En occasion? Looked at me in a way that suggested he understood more than he let on. I told him I'd be there. I booked a one-way ticket and told myself I could always book the return whenever I needed to leave. I drove a rental car to the golf club on a Saturday evening in August, when the light over Lake Ontario was doing something extraordinary, all gold and low and unhurried. The club had been redone recently, new stone facade, new landscaping, the kind of renovation that announces itself without quite saying the number out loud. My parents were members. They had been members for 11 years. This was, in the language of my family, a relevant credential. My mother met me in the lobby and kissed my cheek and looked me over the way she always did, scanning for something she could comment on neutrally. She told me I looked tired. I told her the flight had been fine. My father was somewhere near the bar with 3 other men who all looked like variations of my father, and he raised his glass in my direction from across the room in a gesture that I had learned, over decades, to interpret as the full extent of his welcome. My brother found me and hugged me properly, which was something he had started doing in the last couple of years, as though he'd learned it somewhere and was still practicing. He was wearing a blazer I was certain cost more than my first month's rent in Calgary. He looked happy in the way that people look happy when everything has gone according to plan, and I was glad for him, genuinely, even as I felt the familiar low-grade ache of standing in a room where I had always been the footnote. He introduced me to Claire, who shook my hand with both of hers and smiled with her whole face. She had dark hair cut short and an ease about her that had nothing to do with the club or the gold light or the occasion. She said she had heard a lot about me. I thought that was a polite thing people say, and I smiled and said something polite back. A woman in a black vest came to tell us our seats were ready. I had assumed, without really thinking it through, that I would be seated near my brother and his fiancée, near the front of the room where the family was gathering. I followed the server through the dining room, past the tables with the low floral arrangements and the good candles, past my parents' table, and the table where Marcus's university friends were already laughing about something, through a narrow passage near the back, past the door to the service corridor, to a small round table beside the coat check alcove. There were 4 other people at the table, none of whom I knew. One was a distant cousin of my father's, who I had met once at a funeral. The others appeared to be +1s of +1s, people at the outermost ring of the event's social gravity. The coat check itself was a folding table with a handwritten sign, and it was close enough to my chair that when someone came to drop off a jacket during dinner, they would be standing roughly beside me. I sat down. I put my napkin in my lap. I poured myself a glass of water. One of the strangers at my table said, "Some view, hey," gesturing toward the coat check alcove, and laughed. And I laughed too, and thought, there it is. There is the whole of it, right there. I had known, in the abstract, that my parents would always find a way to tell me where I stood. I had known it intellectually, in the clinical language my therapist and I had spent 2 years developing. But knowing a thing and sitting beside a coat check alcove at your brother's engagement party, while your parents hold court at the head table across the room, those are 2 different kinds of knowing. The dinner was good. The wine was good. I talked to the distant cousin about the expansion of the 407 extension and whether the new development in Milton was going to change the commute patterns, and I was pleasant and present, and I did not let my face do anything my mother could report back on later. This was a skill I had developed over many years, and I was, by now, quite good at it. The speeches started after the main course. My father stood up and spoke about Marcus with the unguarded pride that I had spent my childhood watching him reserve for this specific occasion. His son, his legacy, the version of his life that had gone correctly. He told a story about Marcus's first job offer, how he'd called the house at 7 in the morning, practically shouting down the phone. He told the room that Marcus had always known what he wanted, and had gone out and gotten it, and that this was the quality he was proudest of. He raised his glass. The room raised their glasses. I raised mine from the coat check alcove, and nobody in particular noticed. My mother spoke briefly and beautifully about Claire, about how glad they were to welcome her to the family, about how Marcus had chosen well. She used the word family 4 times. She did not say my name once. I kept my face completely still. Dessert arrived. A lavender crème brûlée, and I remember that specific detail, because I cracked the surface with my spoon, and watched the caramel shatter, and I thought about how much I had built in 4 years, and how completely invisible it was in this room, and I made a decision, very quietly, sitting next to the coat check alcove, with my crème brûlée, that this was the last time. Not the last time I would see my family. I wasn't sure about that yet. But the last time I would sit quietly in a chair that told me exactly what I was worth to these people, and say nothing and smile and pretend the chair was fine. I didn't do anything with the decision. I just held it. It felt solid. After dessert, people began to move around, the way they do at the end of formal dinners, when the structure relaxes and everyone drifts into smaller conversations. I had been talking to Claire's aunt about her garden in Red Deer when I felt a hand on my arm. It was Claire. She had that expression people get when they've been trying to place something and it's finally clicked, a kind of lit up, slightly stunned recognition. She was looking at me the way you look at someone when you've just realized you know who they are. I have been trying to figure out why your name sounded familiar since Marcus first mentioned you, she said. She still had her hand on my arm. He told me you were a physiotherapist in Calgary, and I thought I'd read something, and then I just remembered. I didn't understand what she was talking about. Canadian Health Review, she said. The under 35 feature. The photo was different. Your hair was up. That's why I didn't place you immediately. She shook her head like she was still working through the surprise. You're the one who built those 2 clinics. The one whose post-surgical recovery program got cited in that University of Calgary study. I printed that article. I have it at my office. We use it in our no-problem training sessions as a case study on patient-centered care models. I didn't say anything for a moment. You're used as a teaching example, she said, and she was smiling now, warm and completely sincere, with no awareness at all that the room around us had begun, in a quiet and incremental way, to pay attention. Marcus never said, he said you had a clinic, but he didn't say any of this. Why didn't he say any of this? The room had not frozen the way a room freezes in a dramatic film. It was more gradual than that. A conversation nearby tapered off. My father's voice, which had been carrying from the head table, went quiet. My mother, who I had not looked at directly all evening, turned in her chair. My brother Marcus had come to stand a few feet away, and he was looking at Claire and then at me, with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something uncertain and raw, like a door had opened onto a room he hadn't known was there. Claire kept talking. She asked me about the second location, about whether I was looking at a third, about a specific technique mentioned in the study. She was entirely, genuinely interested, and her interest had the unintentional power of a floodlight. In a dark room, it lit up the space around me and threw everything else into contrast. I answered her questions. My voice was steady. I told her about the second clinic, about the staff I'd hired, about the research partnership that had started informally, because a sports medicine physician at the Foothills Hospital had started sending me his most complicated cases. I told her about the morning I had walked into the second location for the first time after we signed the lease, how the rooms had been empty and echoing, and I had stood in the center of it by myself and thought, I did this. I was aware, the entire time, of my mother sitting very still at the head table. Marcus stepped forward. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, quietly, the way you say something when you're saying it to yourself as much as to anyone else. I didn't know. I knew you were doing well, but I didn't actually know. I didn't tell you, I said. That was true. I hadn't. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't know how yet. That was okay. Some reckonings take more than one conversation. The distant cousin from my coat check table had drifted over and was telling someone nearby that I was his cousin. I had not known until that moment that he was the kind of person who would do that, but people surprise you. My father came to find me later, near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had collected their jackets from the coat check alcove beside my table and gone home. He was a man who had never in my life apologized for anything directly, and he did not apologize now. What he did was stand beside me and look out at the mostly empty dining room and say, after a long pause, "The girl seems sharp. Your brother chose well. Her name is Claire," I said. "And she's a nurse practitioner. She's not a girl." He was quiet for a moment. "She thinks very highly of your work." "I know," I said. "She told me." He nodded once, slowly, and walked back toward my mother, who was still sitting at the head table. She had a glass of wine in her hand that she hadn't been drinking. She was looking at the table in front of her, and her expression was the specific expression of someone who is recalibrating something they believed to be settled, and finding that the mathematics no longer work. I did not go to speak to her that night. I thought about it, standing there in the room that smelled of crème brûlée and cut flowers, and I made the considered choice not to. Not out of cruelty, not even out of the satisfaction that I'll admit, quietly, was somewhere in the room with me. But because I had spent so many years walking toward her, hoping she would meet me halfway, and my therapist and I had done a lot of work on understanding that hope, and I was not ready to spend it again just yet. I found my brother near the entrance, helping Claire into her jacket. He pulled me aside for a moment, while she was saying goodbye to a friend. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. 2 words, no scaffolding. "For what specifically?" I asked, because I think it matters to name things. He thought about it seriously, which was something I hadn't expected. "For not asking," he said finally. "I knew things weren't. I knew how it was at home. I just let it be that way because it was easier for me." I told myself it wasn't my business. "It wasn't your business," I said. "But you're right that you let it be." "Yeah." He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor. "Can I come to Calgary sometime? See the clinic?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. I drove back to the hotel alone, on the highway that runs along the lake, with the windows down and the August air coming in thick and warm. The city light reflected off the water on the left side of the road, and I thought about the woman who had eaten a cold sandwich in a hospital parking lot in February, and heard her mother say she would have had an easier life without her. I thought about the $12,000 and the waiting list, and the empty room where I had stood alone, and known that I had built something real. I thought about the coat check alcove. There is something that happens when you have been invisible for a long time, and someone finally sees you, not because you demanded it, not because you forced the moment, but because you were simply there, in the room, being exactly who you had become. It doesn't fix anything, it doesn't undo the years, but it changes the texture of what you carry, somehow. The weight is the same, but it sits differently. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was Marcus. A voice message, which he had never sent me before in his life. I didn't listen to it, until I was parked in the hotel lot with the engine off. His voice was quieter than usual, a little unsteady. He said, "I've been sitting here thinking about all the times you called, and I didn't ask how things were going because I figured you were fine. You always seemed fine. And I realized I never asked, because I didn't want to have to say anything about the way things were. That was selfish. I'm working on it. I wanted to say that. Okay. Good night." I listened to it twice. My mother called me 3 days later, while I was between patients at the clinic, and left a voicemail that said she thought it might be nice if we had dinner together when things settled down, and that she had heard from Claire that I had been doing well in Calgary. The word Claire used was exceptional. My mother said this carefully, precisely, as though she were reading from a document she had prepared in advance. I stood in the hallway of the clinic I had built, and listened to my mother describe my life back to me in words borrowed from my brother's fiancée, and I felt something in me that was not quite forgiveness, and not quite distance, but something in between, something that had not had a name before that moment. It felt like the very first steps of a very long walk, and I was not yet sure where it was going, and I was not prepared to rush it. I called her back that evening. I told her the dinner sounded fine, and that I would let her know when I was next in Ontario, and that I was glad Marcus had found someone like Claire. She said she was proud of what I had built. I said thank you. I did not ask her to mean it. I decided to let it be what it was: small, imperfect, years too late, and see whether it grew into something or didn't. That felt like the honest thing to do. That felt like the thing my patients teach me every day in the clinic. That recovery is not a dramatic reversal. It is incremental. It is unglamorous. It is showing up to the same room again and again, and doing the work even when the progress is invisible. You do the work, and eventually, one way or another, the room changes. I went back to Calgary on a Tuesday morning, early flight out of Pearson. Coffee from the Tim Hortons in the terminal, because some habits belong to a specific version of yourself and you carry them forward. I watched the lake disappear beneath the clouds as we climbed, all that water going gray and small, and then we were above it all, heading west into a sky that was completely clear. The clinic opened at 8. My first patient was a marathon runner, recovering from an ACL repair, 4 weeks post-op, frustrated with the pace of progress. The way people always are at 4 weeks. I sat across from her and told her what I always tell people at 4 weeks, that the work she was doing now, the slow and invisible work, was the most important work. That the body was doing things she couldn't see yet. That she had to trust the process even when the process didn't feel like anything. She said, "How do you know it's working if you can't see it?" "Because you keep showing up," I said. "That's how you know." She thought about that. Then she nodded, and we got back to work.